Matthew has written for the American Prospect, Atlantic Monthly, Think Progress, and he now writes for Slate. He won the Hillman Prize in 2007. I think one of the best things I can say about him is although he has no formal economics training, he writes and thinks like an economist, and that's a compliment from my perspective. He's probably my favorite economics blogger. So it's really exciting for me to have him here. I guess one of the best things I can say about him, although he doesn't have any formal training, one of the nice things about economics is you don't have to have formal training to call yourself an economist. We don't have occupational licensing for economics, right? So I'm going to introduce him, rather than as an economics blogger, I'm going to introduce him as an economist who happens to run a blog. So this is Matthew Yglesias, and he's going to talk to us about why the rent is so damn high.
Thank you. Thank you. Two of my uncles have PhDs in economics, and I think would not accept me into the bar, at the Thanksgiving table, no matter what I said. But I don't know. This is a talk that's based on a book project that I put out last year under the title "The Rent Is Too Damn High." It's an ebook original. You can buy it on Amazon, just $4. You should. My publisher will send ninjas after me if I don't relentlessly try to get people to buy it. But also you can just listen. I've given talks on this to sort of audiences of architects, to audiences of urban planners, real estate developers, affordable housing advocates, never really to economists and economics students, but if that's I hope the background of some of you here. And at any rate, one term that you hear in the economics world and in your economics classes is the idea of rents. And this is normally used in economics metaphorically. The idea is that sometimes through regulatory schemes or some other things, people manage to capture a kind of undeserved profit that doesn't, relate to any sort of productive business activity that they've undertaken. But of course, there's a reason that this is known as rents in the economics literature, and it's that it originally came from the analysis of actual rent that you pay to a landlord. And this was thought to be a very significant problem in the early days of economics. The so-called classical economists, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, they were writing at a time really before the Industrial Revolution had taken hold. Lots and lots of people were farming, and who owned the land and who paid rent on the land was an extremely important thing at that point in time. And one of the main themes in Ricardo's book is the idea that rent is an unusual way to make money in economics. That if you tax people's labor, if you tax the labor of farmers, they might have less incentive to go work and go produce things. If you tax the capital, the equipment and the buildings and things that people build, they might have less incentive to sort of build houses and amass equipment. But if you tax the land rents, right, the rent that the farmer just has to pay to the guy who owns the land that he's working on, you don't really get anything, right? It's not that people aren't going to produce land if you tax them for it, because, of course, the land is just there. People don't own land because they made it, typically. They own it because they inherited it from someone or they just happened to buy it. This whole question of literal rents sort of really went out because people started building factories, and farming was just sort of a marginal enterprise. It didn't really matter, and the rent that most people paid is just rent on their house, right, or maybe for a store or a commercial lease of some kind, but not the key sort of productive enterprise. At the same time, housing costs, they are a really big deal to people. If you look at the consumer expenditure surveys, you see that after sort of healthcare and education expenses, housing and transportation are the big thing that people spend money on. But it's not something that you hear a lot about in the kind of national policy conversation. But I got interested in it because I'm interested in cities, and I'm interested in the geography of where people go and where they locate themselves. And so one thing that originally was very striking is that there's been a lot of population growth in the South and the Southwest. Texas has been really big, also Arizona to some extent, here in Tennessee, North Carolina has had a lot of growth. And a question arises as to, why would that be, right? Why are so many people moving to those places? One answer pretty clearly is the weather. People like it to be warmer rather than colder. Yglesias has tried to do a study about this, and he shows that you can do a correlation of the temperature in February controlling for other things, and people try to go to warmer areas. But then other kinds of issues get on the agenda. Rick Perry is the governor of Texas, and he was recently on television, and he was saying to people, California just put its income tax rate up higher, and Texas has no income tax rate. And so Governor Perry was up there, and he was saying, all these rich Californians, you've all been moving to Texas, and now, you're going to come at a sort of even faster pace. A guy named Jed Kolko works for a real estate website, Trulia.com. He took a look at this, and he was able to show it's not true. It is true that there's been a lot of people moving out of California and a lot of people moving into Texas, but it's actually not the wealthiest people who pay the highest taxes in California. It tends to be poorer people are the ones who've been migrating. And he speculated that the reason for that is not taxes, but it's housing prices. It's much cheaper to get a place to live in Texas than in California. And I think that he's correct. I think there's a lot of analysis to back that up. One reason you can tell that it's the price of housing that's driving people out of coastal areas is that housing continues to be very, very expensive. Right? If nobody wanted to live in San Francisco, it would be cheap to live in San Francisco. And there are cities that are like that, right? It's really the case that approximately nobody wants to live in Detroit. And so it's dirt cheap. But Boston is not cheap. The New York City area is not cheap. Washington, D.C., where I live, is not cheap. None of coastal California is cheap. Those places aren't gaining many people, but there's clearly a high level of demand to live in them. So, naturally, any sort of basic economics would say, well, if there's so much demand to live there, why don't they build more houses? Then more people could live there. And the answer is that really you can't. You cannot build more houses in these places, not because it's technologically impossible to add to the housing stock, but because it's largely illegal. Because since 1970, all across America, we've had an incredible increase in the stringency of zoning regulations that take place, the rules about what you're allowed to build and where. We have many more people in the country than we had since 1970, and that even exaggerates the extent of our increased housing needs because people have smaller families than they used to. So there's many, 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 many more households than we used to have, but not that many new houses in some of the highest demand places. So this is something that, when I was originally thinking about this, I was thinking about large coastal cities. I grew up in New York. I went to college in the Boston area. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. But you really see as you go around the country that these similar dynamics actually do take place everywhere. Here in Murfreesboro, I can't claim to be an expert on it, but before I came down here, I took a look at the local city zoning code. One reason I'm not an expert on it is that the zoning ordinance is 300 pages long. And this is not that big a town, in the scheme of things, but it's very long. Just downloading the map was very difficult because it's so big. The map can't be color-coded because there's so many different zones on it. So you have there's a red splotch and a yellow splotch, but then you have to look into the fine print. There's 4 different single-family home zones. So those are areas where you can build a house, but you can't build an apartment building. The reason they're differentiated is by how big does the lot have to be. So there's some places where you can have an 8,000 square foot lot, some places where you can have a 12,000 square foot lot, some places where you can have a 16,000 or 14,000. I forget exactly what it is. There's 3 different kinds of zones for apartments. Most places the apartments can only be 3 stories high. Some places they can be 5 stories high. Then there's a set of places where you can have duplexes, but I guess not anything denser than that. And Murfreesboro is not at all unusual in that regard. It's very typical. And Americans think of themselves as living in a very sort of a free market country. People tend to be enthusiastic about sort of capitalism and markets here, and definitely think of America as a less regulated sort of marketplace, a place where at least, there should be a default that people can kind of do what they want with their property. But when it comes to land, it's really not true. We have a very intensive, central planning infrastructure, and it's even, they call themselves planning departments, and they write down in pretty excruciating detail, what you can do, where you can do it, and there's a lot of rules about sort of, how much housing you can build, how large lots you have to have. Some places it only leads to sort of, I would say, minor kinds of issues. So that here, as best I could tell, right around college campus, you might think that the economically optimal thing to do would be to slap up maybe a few big apartment buildings that could have some cheap housing for students. Students could get to campus very easily and conveniently. But instead, it looked to me like it was zoned so that single-family homes on relatively large lots had to come around. Students might need to come from further away and sort of commute. I don't know. It possibly works out, okay for people in the end. But when you get into other parts of the country, it's become a huge constraint on the ability of cities to sort of grow and thrive. That Texas cities tend to have A, laxer regulation than you have in coastal cities, and B, the area is not that crowded. Texas has a lot of empty space as of yet. Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio have grown and grown and grown, but they haven't yet sort of blobbed into one another the way Philadelphia and New York have. On the coasts, we've sort of run out of space to sprawl. There's incredibly bad traffic jams. And even though the cities are, they're denser than Murfreesboro, they're very expensive, and you can't build them up. In Washington, where I live, it's a big city, the capital of the mightiest empire the world has ever known. You can't have an office building that's more than 12 feet tall. Apartment buildings you can't build in the vast majority of the space. Where you can build them, they usually can't be more than sort of 8 feet tall. We have the highest hotel prices in the country. We have the most expensive office rents in the central business district. We have the second or third highest housing costs. And so you should have a booming market in constructing more sorts of structures there, but you don't because you're not allowed to sort of build at greater density. And as I see it, this is a local issue. These are policies that are made by local policymakers, but it turns out to have national implications because a lot of the places that are most expensive to go live are also the places where they have the most economic opportunities. That the average wages in the Bay Area, around San Francisco, San Jose, Silicon Valley, between them, that's one of the highest income parts of the entire United States. Some of that is because there's sort of, rich computer programmers, the founders of big software companies there. But some of it is just that like most Americans' jobs are providing services, local services to other people. You could be cutting hair, you could be doing brain surgery, you could be cooking restaurant meals, you could be, an architect. I mean, there's all kinds of things people do, but they're doing things for other people. They're teaching college students. Ideally, you want to do those things in a big concentration where there's a lot of people, preferably affluent people, who you can sell your services to. And you want to build deep markets in which you can have lots of different vendors and lots of different sellers. And so to an extent, that is what you have in the Bay Area. It's what you have in New York. It's what you have in Boston. But an awful lot of that is clawed back by the very high cost of living in these sort of areas. That I saw one study, people talk a lot about inequality these days. There has been a lot of income inequality. One form of that inequality is the gap between what people with college degrees earn and what people without college degrees earn. And some studies have been done which say that, well, actually a lot of that inequality is sort of clawed back if you adjust for the differential cost of living. But I think that's probably the wrong way to look at it, because the housing is expensive in part because it's desirable housing. Like living in New York, say, might be cool, it might be fun. It's certainly better than doing what some people do, which is living 90 minutes outside and having an extremely long commute. So people are paying for value to some extent, but they're also paying for scarcity. And it's a scarcity that we have the capacity to resolve, that some problems that we face as a society seem really tough. It's hard to know what we could do to really deliver much better health care to people at a much lower cost. People have some ideas, but it's not obvious. The economics of it are hard, and also the science of it is hard. Curing diseases is hard. I don't want to say that building buildings is easy. I don't know how to do it, but people know how to do it. I mean, we know as a society, how to put houses up, how to put offices up. But we're not allowing ourselves to go and do it. And it's sort of strangles that sort of economic growth. It has a secondary set of problems, which is associated with the environment. That you have some amount of concern with just urban sprawl that's induced when you're not allowed to get denser where you have the highest demand. But you also just have a problem because the environmental impact of living in different places is different. That one reason California became a popular place to live in the first place is that they have really good weather there. And that's good for the people who live there. It's nice, it's temperate, they have fun. But it also turns out to be pretty good for the world. San Diego, people who live in the San Diego area have far and away the lowest carbon footprint of any city in America. A little bit that has to do with green energy sources in San Diego, but what most of it has to do with is that the weather is fantastic, so people don't air condition their houses and they don't turn the heat on. And if you look at the top 10 sort of cleanest metro areas in the country, 6 of them are located in California. And again, that's primarily about the weather. It has a little bit to do with the West Coast electricity generating mix. And those are cities where, from an ecological standpoint, I would like to see more people living. We don't need to force them to live there, but it's particularly tragic to see that people aren't able to live there because they're not able to afford to go live there, when it's a problem that we kind of have the ability to resolve and to fix ourselves. It's become this barrier to literal mobility of people, to economic mobility, to this sort of ecological mobility. And I think that where it becomes more speculative is that it seems to hurt the ability to build more dynamic kinds of marketplaces in services. That when you have larger cities, there's some evidence that people become more productive at what they're doing because they can focus and specialize more. So, that's sort of the basic view. We should let people build these sort of taller, bigger cities. And unfortunately, the politics around it get quite tangled. That this is basically an idea to say we should have less regulation, we should have more markets, we should go do things. But the people and political movements who are associated with those causes in the United States, in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement, tend to be fairly hostile to sort of cities and to urbanism. And because they see cities as places where Democrats and liberals live. Then conversely, the people who live in the cities tend to have left-wing political views and are sort of prejudiced against deregulatory solutions. And I've seen in my area a number of elements of this, that you had the state government in Virginia wanted to pass a fairly mild law that was going to say that you're allowed to build apartment buildings near commuter rail stations. And that seems, kind of like a no-brainer. I mean, if you bothered to build this commuter rail network, presumably you want people to live near the stations. At least you want people to be able to live near the stations. But it was the Tea Party group in Virginia was one of the sort of leading groups that mobilized against this. And they said that it was part of an Agenda 21 plot from the United Nations. I don't know if you guys know about this conspiracy theory. But there's an idea out there in conservative circles that there's a UN program called Agenda 21 that's designed to force everyone to live in extremely dense cities. And so when anything comes out that would sort of allow the construction of higher density housing, this gets mixed up with this kind of culture war politics. There's conservative opposition to it. At the same time, you tend to have people on the left have just sort of I don't know, prejudices against deregulatory views. I think sometimes a lack of belief that supply and demand forces can really be allowed to balance these things and will really work effectively. And then you also have people who sort of policy entrepreneurs who want to emphasize other aspects of policy. I started talking about Rick Perry in Texas, and I really do think this has been an extremely successful aspect of public policy in Texas, that they exaggerate sometimes the extent to which there's a zoning deregulation there, but compared to other states, it is very easy to get building permits there, and it's been a real triumph. They have had an enormous amount of population growth, but it's a little bit curiously something that the public officials there don't emphasize that much. They like to talk about some of the other things things they've done that are a little bit more salient on the national scene, and it doesn't get the level of discussion that it deserves. Then last, this is really a tragedy for sort of the lowest income people. That I saw a map that the National Low Income Housing Coalition produced last week. And it's a map whose idea is to show, well, how many hours would you have to work in a week in a given place at the minimum wage in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment? So it captures both, what's the minimum wage in this state, and also, what's the cost of housing. And the 10 states, if I think I can remember it correctly, it was that were worst. It was New York, it was Virginia, it was Maryland, it was D.C., it was New Jersey, it was Connecticut, it was California, it was New Hampshire, it was Massachusetts, it was Rhode Island. Those are obviously pretty liberal places, and they tend to be places that have some of the higher minimum wages that are out there, but they were the places where minimum wage workers had the least ability to sort of go afford a house. And that's not because the minimum wage is high, but it's because those places are become so expensive to live in that it's completely undermined the sort of policy that liberals think they've enacted to try to help low-wage workers. And it's really swamped it. It makes quite a big difference that in the places where housing is cheapest, you can get a 2-bedroom apartment on about 60 or 70 hours worth of minimum wage work. So, you need to work a job and a half, or have two. It's not, it's not good to be making the minimum wage anywhere, but it's maybe doable. In a place like New York, it was 134 hours, which no one has 134 hours to do in a week if you try to do the math. That's just terrible. And so people get by with a certain amount of subsidies. We have housing voucher subsidies, we have public housing, but there's no place where it's easy to qualify for any of those programs because, they cost money, there's only so much money available, and there's really only so much you can do on the subsidy side, because if you have only so many houses to go around, it's hard to organize who's gonna come live in them. You have a lot of different sort of proposed solutions, inclusionary zoning ideas, things I can talk about. But you have not really seen a place, an expensive place, I think, tackle this issue squarely, which is by saying, we really just need to let people build much, much, much more stuff where it's most expensive to do it. And I think it's, it sounds, in some ways it sounds modest, in other ways if you put it to people, it sounds quite radical to say, look, we should let people do what they want, build some big buildings here. But at the same time, I do think that at some point we will do it, and we're going to look back on this era of very high housing costs and very low levels of geographical mobility as a kind of slightly insane time when we inflicted this massive problem on ourselves where nobody could get enough places to live in one of the richest, wealthiest places that's ever existed, not because we lack the ability to have, row houses or elevators or a little bit more sprawl out here, but simply because, we wouldn't allow it. With that, I think maybe I'll wrap it up and see if people have some questions and if we can have some discussion. No, not you. No, yeah, go for it.
I was wondering whether you could speak to, maybe to some degree or some length, why we have these policies in the first place, and what might be the motivations, about not in my backyard, maybe Section 8 types. Anything you might want to
right.
About what kind of brought upon this?
Absolutely. The history of zoning is long and fascinating, and it starts with, I think, a fairly reasonable concern, which has to do with public health and people putting factories right by other people's houses. And obviously, that could be annoying, but it could also be dangerous and genuinely hazardous, and particularly when you're talking about the kind of industrial activity that existed maybe 100 years ago or more. But what's come into place actually much more recently is an increasingly elaborate set of restrictions on exactly what it is you're able to do in different kinds of places. So I saw there's a section here of Murfreesboro where there's a special rule saying you can have a funeral home for people, but not for pets. And I don't know that that's a big deal economically exactly, that you can't have a pet crematoria in one particular section of downtown. But it's also a little hard to say what the big issue is with that. And you have I mean, you use the word "not in my backyard," and that's obviously one of the sentiments here. There's people don't like to have certain things abutting their properties, and you oftentimes have, I think, systems in place that are not designed to even capture people's preferences about this very well. I was following on Twitter earlier today a controversy that's happening in my neighborhood, where there's a petition to make a rule that says you can't have any more liquor licenses in this one part of town. And the way this goes is that, as best as I can tell, not that many people who live here even have this problem. Very few of us are concerned about there being bars and restaurants in our backyard. And in fact, it's a place where there's a lot of bars and restaurants. And that's one reason why my wife and I moved there 4 months ago. We like those places. It's a vibrant, exciting neighborhood. But a handful of people, at least the way the DC laws work, you can get a relatively tiny number of people together, and then this moratorium process starts. And then the question becomes, who shows up at the meeting? And the people who show up at the meetings tend to be sort of like cranks. And they come in and they have the power to block things, but there's very little way to sort of countervail that they had a lot of people who were organizing to come to the meeting on the other side, which is great. And I think in the end, this moratorium isn't going to happen, but it kind of slows things down and drags it out. And I think one of the things that you get that drives bad ideas in this regard is that a lot of different people over the decades have really pushed the idea of expensive houses as a wealth building strategy for the United States, that people are very much encouraged to sort of go into debt, to take out mortgages, to buy homes, and then are told that making house prices go up is always good and making house prices go down is always bad. If you think about other kinds of assets that people own, we don't think about it that way, right? I mean, nobody thinks that, well, if we could make cars much more expensive, then we'd all be better off. Because after all, most of us own cars, so then we'll all be rich, right? We say, no, most of us do own cars, but the cars are going to break. We're going to need another car at some point. Our kids are going to want cars. Maybe I don't have a car at the moment because our car did break and we haven't gotten a new one yet. And if cars get more expensive, we're going to have fewer cars. What we want is a society where, there's enough cars for everybody. And we want enough televisions for everybody, enough computers for everybody. But with houses, people have decided in a slightly confused way that it's in their interests to make houses sort of systematically more expensive. And so there's a premium put on scarcity, even while at the same time you have a sort of you have a niche politics of affordable housing for poor people, but then you have a mass politics of expensive houses for the middle class, which can't, it's true that if the particular house that I own gets more expensive compared to every other house in America, that I benefit. But if all of our houses get more expensive, you can't really win like that. And that's part of the lesson that we should have taken away from the whole sort of mortgage bust fiasco of 5 years ago. Because what happened there was that everybody's houses were getting more expensive. So everybody decided, well, we can take out bigger and bigger loans against these houses. And eventually it becomes unsustainable because everything can get more expensive simultaneously faster than people have actual income. And it all collapsed. And, a lot's changed in the past 5 years. But one thing that hasn't changed, I think, is that mentality around sort of home ownership and housing scarcity as a wealth-building strategy. And it's very short-sighted. The particular local dynamics in each neighborhood, are different. And there's always sort of issues around that. But I see that as like the big picture kind of national driving force.
I have 2 quick follow-ups.
Yeah.
One, when did this mentality begin?
Right.
If you were under, the Clinton or Bush,
Uh-huh.
Or has it always been that way for
Right.
the past 50 years? And then secondly, I guess what I was thinking of, not in my backyard,
Mm-hmm.
is perhaps, at least from the conservative or perhaps more libertarian perspective, we might see these, or might think that these policies are the fruit of, well, I don't want to live next to certain kinds of people.
Right.
And so I'm going to make living in my neighborhood, so we got gated communities, we got potted, fancy, rows with plants and stuff like that, flowers. We want to make it expensive as humanly possible so that the only person that's ever going to live next door to me is going to be a millionaire and who's not going to paint their house pink.
Yeah.
To what degree is that just like fantasy, or?
No, I mean, I think you definitely do see. I think like one way where you see that really clearly is in like rules about where you can put mobile homes down. People don't want to live in like that kind of neighborhood or near those kind of people, and you do see. I mean, some efforts of people to move away from living near poor people, and that's what I call that's the very local dynamic, right? Like, why are we having this here? Why are we having this there? But there is a sort of a broader question. Well, why can't we on a citywide basis? Like, why can't we plan for growth? Why don't we have any kind of allocations anywhere? And I think that does speak to this kind of bigger picture type stuff. Government policies to promote home ownership go back a ways, really into the 30s and 40s. But originally it had something more of a basis in what was more of an agricultural economy at that point. I think you don't start to see the housing scarcity problem really originate until in the 70s. I'm not sure it's because that's when policy changed or simply that's when the coastal metro areas started like running out of land. Because the basic suburbanization policies in the 50s, they're very successful initially. The houses get built, people move out to them. There's some problems associated with it, but it's basically working fine. And I think we started to run out of space, basically, in some places around in the early 70s. I don't know. That's
control really started to be a thing. It started to be a lot more prevalent. Do you think that discouraged the building of houses, and maybe that's what influenced people that add to that policy? And do you think that we would be more beneficial if we maybe removed rent control?
Well, I think some places would definitely see benefits from removing rent control. I mean, but it's interesting, if you get a sort of a textbook or a basic pamphlet story of like why would rent control be bad, that's exactly the story you'll get, is that it discourages new construction, and so ultimately you're sort of undermining yourself, which would be true in a place where you were allowed to engage in construction. If you actually look at Manhattan, where I grew up, rent control still exists in New York, but it's been sort of slowly fading away. It hasn't led to a huge boom in new housing supply in Manhattan, not because there's no profits to be made building housing in Manhattan, but simply because it's very difficult from a regulatory viewpoint to add a lot. So to some extent, we've gotten the worst of both worlds. That rent control policies have been relaxed a little. So you've had a little bit of new construction, but because it's still very constrained, all the new construction has been very high-end luxury construction, which has then led people to believe that new construction doesn't do anything to sort of help with this problem, and has rebuilt political support for some of the rent controls that were alleviated. Also in Massachusetts, they sort of blanket abolished rent control. Again, not a terrible idea, but it didn't have the desired effect, because the places where there was the most demand for housing were these sort of these zoned out Boston suburbs, which had essentially rules against becoming denser, even though they were very close to the city, often by T-stops near major universities. So when you lifted rent control, they really did just become more expensive. And it operated, exactly how a rent control proponent would have warned, that you're going to lift this, only rich people are going to be able to live here. You didn't have at all the effect of like the construction boom and sort of housing plenty. I don't think that proves that the rent controllers were sort of ultimately correct in their diagnosis, but you have to remember when you're tinkering with any of these aspects of policy that there's like there's a whole framework, and the different pieces all do fit together. And so, people are right to sometimes think that all that's going to happen is they're not going to be able to afford to come into different places. Yeah.
Got a question,
Yeah.
not to monopolize her, but could you give us like an idea, like you're suggesting, I'm kind of spend a lot of time in Texas. I mean, could you give me an example of how much different it would be from, say, New York City? Like, you're saying Murfreesboro's zoning book is like 300 pages, would Dallas's be that size as well, and New York like 10,000, or what's the, maybe not an expert on the size,
right.
But give me an example of the contrast aside from just more flexible versus less flexible.
Oh, sure. I mean, obviously, the length of the books is actually not a great proxy for how these things work. The Texas codes primarily concern themselves with parking, which I think is actually quite pernicious, but it is at least sort of restricted to one domain of what it is that you need to sort of do and need to deal with. New York zoning is not particularly stringent. I mean, it's actually laxer than you would find in most parts of the country. It's just that New York is in extremely, extremely high demand, right? I mean, if you wanted to take the neighborhood where I grew up, where you have 12-story apartment buildings, 20-story office buildings, retail just sort of on random side streets. You could not put that neighborhood in the overwhelming majority of jurisdictions in the United States, I mean, including quite politically conservative ones. I mean, if you tried to take that to the suburbs of Atlanta, they'd kill you. And not just because it's very, very, very illegal. So, but the difference is that New York is like at its regulatory maximum, whereas Dallas, both the municipality of Dallas and especially the suburban areas around Dallas and Fort Worth, Travis County, have a lot of just development potential, where they build out new roads, they build out new things. And one thing that they have in Texas is there's a state-level restriction on the kinds of restrictions that county governments are allowed to impose. So that's sort of helped things along to some extent. Although they do a lot through the parking sort of venue. So I saw here, right, a single-family home in Murfreesboro is supposed to have 4 parking spaces associated with it. A multifamily home is supposed to have 1.1 spaces per bedroom, I think, that's in it. I don't know if that's is in fact more or less than people need. There was a study that actually came out yesterday from some people at UCLA. It was a sort of one of these obvious research findings, but it turns out that when you reduce parking requirements for housing, you get more housing and you get less parking. Which, okay, but it's important. This is something they were debating this very vociferously in Los Angeles, and the mayor put through a relaxation of parking requirements in one particular part of the city, and people were like mystified by this because of course, Los Angeles, a lot of people, a lot of cars, a lot of concerns around parking, and people thought, no, it's going to be a disaster, but it turned out to work fine. They built slightly fewer parking spaces, slightly more houses. There's a somewhat disproportionate population of non-car owners who are living there. People have slightly smaller cars. People just pay more for garages. Like, it's okay. They just, turns out, like, they fit some more people in. And the parking is weird because it's very, very broadly accepted in the United States that you sort of have to have these parking regulations, and we treat it like it's a public benefit, when if anything, it's a kind of a public cost, that if you are subsidizing other people's cars, you're just putting more traffic on the road and creating sort of more problems for other people. And we had in Washington just this like sad story of a theater was going to open in a sort of blighted area, and they'd gotten a lot of subsidies from the city, and they're going to build this theater, and it's going to be great and bring the arts in and jobs and whatever, the stuff people say. And then just yesterday, a different branch of the city government came in and ordered them to stop work on the construction of their stage, not because because what they had was that they were going to use a parking lot that's across the alley from where the theater is, which seemed to make sense. You park, you cross the alley, you go to the theater. But the rule says that the parking has to be on the lot where your building is. But the building that they bought was an old warehouse that takes up the whole lot, right? But if it's a warehouse, it doesn't need to have any parking except a place for the truck to pull in. But if it's a theater, it does need to have parking, 1 space for every 4 seats or something. So you actually can't convert the thing into a theater at all, even though, this is what like the whole city government wanted to do. And there's, people, and it's not like they didn't want people to be able to come drive their cars and park in the theater. It's just that, it was a question of an alley here or there. And that I just think is typical of sort of the knots that people get tied in. Like that's not an outcome anybody wanted. It's not the result of really like a nefarious manipulation of the situation. It's just a result of the problems of trying to sort of guess how much parking different things are going to need and then write it into rules without paying any attention to the situation on the ground. And actually, it turns out, people who want to build apartments, people who want to operate businesses are capable of reaching some kind of guess about, where people are going to be able to park and how much they're going to need, I think. I don't know. I heard it was hard to park here. So maybe it's different. There's a special campus zone. Historic overlays. Well, it is in fact the Murfreesboro Historic Core overlay that prohibits the operation of a pet crematorium in the center of the city. So you can thank it for that, and it also bans liquor stores, I saw, and fraternity and sorority houses. Well, but it's part of the no. I mean, it was just to say that. Like historic preservation is a fascinating concept, and it just turns out that a lot of different ideas can sort of get smuggled in under the banner of preservation. I think some people I know who work on this are just huge enemies of historic preservation. Like I don't think that that's quite right. I mean, I think it's sensible to sometimes pay an efficiency cost in order to maintain something nice. We have the Grand Canyon, that's nice. People build museums, that's nice. Like art is nice, old buildings are cool, saving some is good. But what's going on in practice a lot of the time is weird agendas. Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes people just place a sort of irrational, like infinite weight on some random old building coming around. A lot of the times there's a thought that if you can put a design review commission in place, you're going to guarantee that no ugly buildings ever get built. Which there's something to, but you have a problem not just in the sort of hassle of going through that process, but if you think about like any really aesthetically interesting art or architecture that's ever been done, I think it is worth asking yourself, like, well, could any of these great works have really innovative stuff made it through like a review committee process staffed by whichever neighborhood people were just like bored on Tuesdays and had time to come to this meeting, and I don't know, maybe people bored on Tuesdays have amazing taste, but I'm a little bit skeptical, and I know that one way it works in a lot of places that the rule is that new things have to conform to the existing character. And if you even just try to think about that in purely aesthetic terms, like I'm not sure how much sense it makes. Like, it's not necessarily the case that having everything look similar, looks better. And I think, a lot of cities I've seen, it actually looks really cool that there's modern glass and steel skyscrapers next to like older Art Deco buildings, or I mean, it can be interesting to have juxtapositions of things, and the sort of just idea that sameness per se is worth maintaining doesn't make a lot of sense. And of course, how would these historic neighborhoods have ever gotten built if everything had to be the same all the time, right? I mean, it would just be a historic farm or, cave, or I don't know if you had caves. I'm pro-cave, I guess. No, come on. I came all this way.
So how would it make it cheaper?
Yeah.
And let's say for California.
Yeah.
If they were to go in and build big high-rises, since it's such an expensive place to live
Mm-hmm.
now, to get more people to come to live in California. I mean, because right now everybody has the whole mentality, it's very expensive to live there. So
Right.
How would it make it cheaper per se?
Well, I think you have there's two dynamics that kind of exist, and I was talking to someone here earlier was talking about her neighborhood in Nashville, I think, and where you can see both of these things happening, and one dynamic that takes place is what's called gentrification, and it's where a neighborhood sort of gets better, or middle-class people get priced out of a certain area, and so wealthier people sort of move into the homes that poorer people used to live in. And they come in and occupy them, and they put in granite countertops and, whatever other stuff fancy people like, and it becomes a fancy neighborhood. The other dynamic is what's called filtering. And when filtering happens, a big fancy new building opens up somewhere. It has all the latest and greatest modern amenities. A bunch of relatively prosperous people move in. And then what happens is that over time, things get a little bit more rough around the edges. Newer fashions come into play. And even though the appliances work and the countertops function, they're not like the hottest, latest, most sort of fashionable thing. And so, people of more modest means are able to move into that kind of accommodation, and the new generation of rich people is moving into like even bigger, even fancier, even newer type places. And so what you used to have predominantly in the United States is that kind of filtering, right? New buildings would get built. They were mostly, aimed at the higher end with, some purpose-built construction at the low end. But people would build things, brand new, it's fancy, it's amazing. But then over time, it would filter down the economic spectrum. Now you much more predominantly see the gentrification dynamic, people going into sort of new neighborhoods, lower income people sort of more and more and more at the margins. And the idea in a place like California or the East Coast would be to sort of bring back more filtering, let people put more stuff up. They would probably aim at the people who, have the most money with their construction, but you'd be adding to the sort of total stock of buildings that exist there. And over time, you have enough stuff, things aren't new anymore, and more supply comes. You can't say, in the first year would prices necessarily fall. They might not, because there might just be more people coming in. But, not everybody wants to live in California. Not everybody wants to live anywhere. They just happen to be expensive right now. So if you build some more houses, some more people would come. But then, it evens out, and things sort of start to go down the chain.
How would that affect like the economy as far as like jobs and stuff? Say if you did build something, you had a whole bunch of people
Right.
move in, so then your demand for jobs is going to obviously increase.
Well, and right now, one of the biggest sort of shortfalls in employment is that we have, a huge decline in construction activity from where we were 5 or 6 years ago. There's still enormous unemployment sort of in the construction sector. And people sometimes say, well, it's going to take years before those construction jobs come back because we had so much overbuilding, blah, 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 blah. There's some truth to that. But again, if you look, there's lots of places in America where it's very expensive to build and clearly would be profitable to build some more stuff, create jobs initially, just building the houses, secondarily, as you have a service sector around it. And it's, I think, one of the things we could do. There's a lot of things you could do sort of over the long term to, make things operate better. But one of the main reforms that in the short term would really, I think, spark some investment and real growth would be deregulation in those highest priced, sort of markets where even in a sort of bad construction market, there's clearly lots of desire to move into those kind of cities.
Very dense urban areas, you've got a lot of congestion.
Yes.
Externalities.
Yes.
And, usually it falls under the purview of the local governing body
Mm-hmm.
to set up a public transportation system
Mm-hmm.
to alleviate these. Seems to me maybe they're not going to have as good an idea where to put them if they don't know what people are going to be building this stuff.
Well, to an extent. But I would say the flip side of that is that what you have right now is, investments get made in transportation infrastructure, and what we ought to be doing is making sure that we can sort of maximize the value of those developments, when we go make them, right? That if you're gonna put in like a train somewhere, right, then it becomes particularly perverse to turn that into like a private benefit for the people who happen to live, convenient to where it is, rather than allowing a sort of growth and increase over there. More broadly, obviously, like congestion is a problem. I'm sure, economically minded people all think there should be some kind of, congestion tolling for these things. It could be managed much better. But fundamentally, I mean, I would say that typically, housing follows transportation in one form or another. You build a road, and then people can put stuff near the road. If you build a train station, some different kinds of stuff can go there. If you make it a wider road, more stuff can go. Alternatively, if a very large patch of totally undeveloped land is available, you can buy it up and then build out the road network, as part of doing the real estate development. But I don't think that you necessarily need to, see where people go and then build the transit out to them, that you build transportation and then you should allow for construction around it.
It's still sort of, how do you predict where people would ideally like to be situated?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure you can do a totally non-planned version of some of these things. But a lot of it just has to do with, can we make better use of sort of what it is that we already have, and what it is that's already there. I mean, in Washington, again, we have a metro system. One line of it is like maxed out to capacity. At rush hour, the trains are full. The trains are running as fast as we have the signals to run them. But another line, the north-south line, it's good, it's pretty popular, there's people on it, but the trains don't run as frequently as they might. And also, a lot of the stations are surrounded by 6-story buildings where a 1-bedroom apartment costs $430,000. So, we should have a bigger building there. It's right by the train station. We could run more trains. The whole thing would be more affordable if we had more people and more people running on it. It's my best guess. All right. Well, thank you.